Welcome to the Halloween special with us at Point Blank. Today we'll be showing you how to score for a horror film, which is an extract from our module Composing for Film and TV. Available online, LA and London. Claude Ruel will be your lecturer. As a bonus for those with logic, we've made the project available for download in the description. Please sit back and enjoy.
Okay, let's talk about horror. So, horror might be one of the most intimidating genres to score, but the reality of it is that it's not that difficult once you understand a few concepts. Most people, when they talk about horror and great horror composers, will tell you about concepts such as polytonalities and polychords and things like that. But the reality of it is that if you understand just how to build them, just by using your ear, you will be able to create convincing devices that you'll be able to use to score pretty much any situation. So, well, let's get into it. But before we get into the actual piece, let's talk about the template and let's talk about the different sounds I chose for this one. Well, as you can see, I have my typical orchestral template. You know, it's still a film. We're still in that kind of like Hollywood orchestral sound. But this time you can see that we're not using woodwinds. And there might be different reasons for that. Maybe the first reason is that it's very difficult to use woodwinds in that context without leaning towards something which is too much like fantasy and less like horror. And you will see that I'm actually kind of leaning towards that already by using harp. And the synths I'm using also have that type of a vibe. It's because I wanted to go towards something which was kind of ghostly and something that would remind us of that supernatural horror genre, which is very popular nowadays. So I have my horns, my trombones, don't have any trumpets. You know, trumpets, they have this very heroic, fanfarish sound. So I'm not using trumpets. Then we have some percussion. We have a celeste, which is going to be very important. We have a harp. We have some strings after that. We have our violins and several articulations. We have some lows and highs and some pizzicatos. Really something that works well for horror is to use, if you ever get the opportunity to work with live instruments, what would work really well is to actually use more of a minimal orchestra. So instead of using, you know, a big lush string section, use a smaller string section like a chamber orchestra, because that will give you more of a detailed sound, and strings, when they're less, they're actually sounding more harsh. So you can also consider solo instruments, such as a solo violin or a solo viola or solo cello, which can be very haunting. So let's take a look at the synths. For the synths, I'm using several things. I'm using a couple of patches from a library which is called Symphobia. And it's the library Symphobia 2. They have a bunch of trailer hits, and you'll hear this one I'm using in the middle section. I have an ambience patch, which is basically giving us some sort of an ambient, eerie sound that we can use as a background texture. And then I'm using a patch from the EFM1 from Logic. I'm not creating anything too complicated. I want to focus on the composition here. One thing that I'm doing, however, that can be worth noticing, I'm actually using a sample of a recording of an empty concert hall. You know, I'm trying to recreate a vibe which is a live vibe. You know, I'm using virtual instruments, but I'm trying to have them sound as real as possible. And so what I'm doing is, by using that sound, I'm kind of creating what you would hear in an actual recording, because the style of playing that I'm using here is a style that is very, very quiet. And so strings are playing at their quietest here in that cue. And in most recordings, when this happens, you will hear a lot of the ambient sound of the room. So I'm trying to recreate that to make it more realistic. And this is something you can do also. Let's get into the composition, and let's listen to the first idea. And then I'll explain what I'm doing. This is an idea that may sound complicated. Some of the chords you'll hear in the strings may sound complex, but once I'll explain, you'll see that it's actually not that complicated. So let's listen to it. Okay, so that's the first idea. Really, the foundation of this idea is in the EFM1 arpeggio that I created. And this arpeggio is going to be the foundation of my piece, and it's going to be the foundation of my chord progression. And so if we look at that, we'll have something that is basically based on a bass movement that I decided. And the real thing that I really thought about, the only real thing that I thought about is actually the lowest note movement. And so I started on a G sharp or A flat. And after that, I decided to build my harmonic structure by using tense intervals that I like. An interval that I really like is the semitone, and it's a very useful interval when it comes to creating tension. You know, this is the one we find in Jaws. So I basically decided to create something based on an A flat root note, and then after that I could select random notes and see if I could create interesting things. You know, I could start like that and maybe go to that C note, not really thinking about it, and then go up a semitone and maybe go up, I don't know, I could build intervals like going up a third maybe and then going up another semitone. And I can create something that resembles that. And that's one chord. And then what I'm doing is I'm using my ear to decide whether or not I like it and whether or not it will work in that context. For some reason, this one is a bit too bright. So then I can try other things. What if I did this? Oh, I like this one. I could be using this one. And then what I decided to do is I decided to arpeggiate those figures. Using arpeggiation is very common in horror. Let's try this one. This is what I went for, I think. And then I think I went up there. Yeah, this is what I did. After that, once I was happy with that figure, I decided to arpeggiate it a couple times. And then decided to do something else. So what I did is actually I decided to only change the bass note and keep the upper structure the same. So I went down to G and kept the whole thing the same, and that created extreme tension. And so when you have those tensions in there, it's extremely creepy, right? So now I have a figure that sounds like that. And you can see that it works so well that if it was only played on piano, it would still work. In fact, piano is used very often in horror music. It has that resonance. If you press down the pedal, it has a very eerie and creepy resonance to it, especially if you play, semitones in different ranges. If you go high in the range of the piano, it's also very creepy. Or if you go very low in its range, it's very creepy. Piano is a very versatile instrument, and it's definitely used very often for horror. Going back to what we did, once I had this structure, I could actually decide to use the strings to create even more tension, or maybe to just make the texture a little bit more rich. And this is really what I did. And so with my strings, I just doubled some of the notes, not all of the notes, but some of the notes that were already present in my chord played on the EFM1. Let's listen to the strings plus the pad. And I decided to make the strings a little bit more melodic by playing a very high note that is playing some sort of a melodic figure. And I'm just choosing notes using my ear notes that I think will work. So I'm not really using a lot of theory apart from my knowledge of intervals and my knowledge of knowing which interval will work to create tension. Apart from that, I'm just using my ear and my taste to create chords that I think will fit the vibe. That means that if you want to be comfortable doing that type of music, you will need to develop a good ear, and you will need to do a lot of listening and a lot of transcribing. Let's move on to the next section. After that, we go into something which is going to be the build-up to a jump scare. Nothing's moving, nothing's going to happen, to create that contrast with the big surprise that is coming up. So this is what I'm doing with using that ambience patch. And on top of that, I'm using a string cluster. I'm just doing 2 notes on the strings. Percussion, I'm using wood blocks to help with the texture. This is something that was done in the past. You would not necessarily do that today. I just wanted to do it to pay tribute to the composers who would do it back in the day, such as Bernard Herrmann or even John Williams. He does that all the time. And then our jump scare. So for that, I decided to use a trailer hit. You can easily achieve that if you don't have a patch like this one. You can easily achieve that by combining things such as bass drum and a snare drum, or even just hit sounds. Whatever things you hit that you record in around the house can be used. After something like that, so the basic hit here is going to be the one thing that is going to create the surprise. And then after that, once the audience is surprised and scared, you need to have them very confused. So what I did is I played random notes on the violins. You know, I chose those notes by choosing a series of intervals that I like. So if you look at the MIDI data in there, you'll see augmented fourths, you'll see major sevenths, and you'll see semitones. And the way you would design a line like this one is really by slowing it down. Slow it down, choose your notes one by one, and then speed it up, and then you'll have your result. And you can tweak it depending on your own taste. But this is what it sounds like all together. Right, and then we go into the next section. You can hear that I'm also doing some trombones hits. Again, clusters, semitones. You can design your chords however you want. This is the cool thing about horror, is that you get to experiment with all types of harmonic devices. It's not following any of the violin lines. It's not following anything. It's just here to create even more randomness. You need to lose the audience. The audience needs to be scared and lost and completely confused. This is what we're doing here. Here, I'm doing some tempo changes, and you can see that I'm doing random tempo changes, actually. You know, I was starting at a fairly slow tempo, 83 BPM, and then before that hit, I'm going to 102. So if we listen to the metronome, and then I'm going to 131, you will usually choose those changes according to when you need to be in sync with the different hit points if you're actually scoring a scene. And so this is what I recreated here, and this is what it would look like if you had to speed it up before you get to that hit and then go to that 131. And then you can see that for the next section, I'm actually slowing down the tempo, because now we go into a conclusion which is different. Here, I'm trading on something which is a bit more consonant, and this is the next section really of my piece. This time I wanted to show you things that you can do which are a bit more melodic. And so here I'm trading on another arpeggio, but this time I'm creating a chord which we can easily identify. And this chord is a B minor, to which you add the augmented fifth, or the flat sixth depending on how you want to look at it. Right? And you can then take that figure and use it as an arpeggio. And this is what I decided to use here. To give it more emphasis, I'm actually outlining that with the French horns. So I have this arpeggio played on the EFM1, and my French horns are also playing this arpeggiated figure. And here I'm giving my composition more of a traditional structure by doing a phrase on the French horns and having an answer on the trombones. So this is more traditional. This is more something that will be done in thrillers. So here I'm giving it more of a traditional structure. And then I'm doing some long sustained strings that are going to help me just create a long texture. It's going to be great for any type of underscore, really. Going back here, if we listen to just the strings, you'll hear something that works really well for horror or for anything that needs to be dark, and it's this use of low strings playing in octaves. So the idea here is to have cellos and basses playing in octaves. So you'll have the bass playing the lowest note and the cello playing the same note an octave higher. And this device is used all over the place, not only in horror, in many genres. And that section could actually be only this. Just listen to this with only the low strings. So you could literally do just that, and that would work as an underscore for certain scenes. Here, for the sake of learning, I actually made the texture a little bit more interesting so that you could have more things to look at and maybe more things to inspire you. So I added more instruments. I added the arpeggio, and I added some high strings that are doing, random notes, trying to create still tension here. So my high strings are just doing random notes that I think will sound good with the low notes. And those high strings are also playing in octaves. So you could have violins in octaves or violas and violins in octaves. But as you can see, for most of the harmonic content, most of my explanations are, well, it sounded good to me, so I used it. And you should do the same. Another thing that I wanted to highlight here in the arrangement was my use of the harp. The harp, I don't know if you've noticed it, but it's very quiet in the overall arrangement. Actually, you may not have heard it. And it's because I'm mainly using it for support. I'm using it to build the texture and help the texture and make the texture a little bit more interesting. The arpeggiated figure that I'm playing on the EFM1 is very monotonous, and the sound itself actually has only one real dynamic. It's not an extremely dynamic sound. And so to give it a little bit more interest, I doubled the beginning of the arpeggio with the harp. So let's try to see if you can hear the doubling with the harp if I only solo those two instruments. So here, the harp is actually playing the first three notes of each figure. Let's listen to the harp on its own. And I'm letting the harp resonate. That's very spooky to do that. And the reason why I'm only doing the beginning is because it's creating interest in the texture. If the harp was doubling the figure all throughout, it would actually eventually create a less dynamic texture. Because here you're creating a more dynamic texture by having an accent or an emphasis on the first three notes, and then you have the rest of the figure that is only played by the pad and that resonates in a very different way. In a more pure way, if you will. I'm doing this exact same thing later on when I'm reintroducing the pad. The pad is going up and down, if we listen to it on its own. It's going up and down, and the harp is only going up. So the harp is only doing the upward motion. It's only doing the first half of the arpeggio. Another thing that you may notice is that my performance of the harp, especially in that section, is a bit clumsy, and I could have easily quantized it, but what I decided to do is keep it clumsy to create more of an unsettling vibe. It's great. We don't really notice that it's actually clumsy, and the harp is actually here to help the texture, and once everyone's playing, you don't really notice it. It's more something that you can feel. And what I'm doing here with the arpeggiated figure on the FM1 is I'm basically taking the figure we had at the beginning, so this figure, and then I'm trying to be creative with it. So I'm applying some of the same techniques I was applying earlier. For example, I'm deciding to take that lowest note, that bass note, down. but keeping the upper structure the same. So I have something that sounds like that. And then, once I have this figure, I'm actually deciding to move it around. So here I'm doing it in E, and I can do the exact same thing. And then once I have that, I can move it around somewhere else. Let's do it in F. So then I can create my own path, and I'm creating something that can be endless, because there's no real key center here. So I can just take that figure, move it around, and resolve when I need to resolve it. And I think I end up resolving the whole thing on E minor. So this is my resolution on E minor. I'm actually doing an inversion of E minor if you've noticed. And I'm doing the exact same thing. But instead of using the 5th, I'm using the 9th here. And this is what's the most important thing to consider, you know, how those intervals work together and are combined together to create that tension. Okay, so let's listen to the conclusion again. Alright, so at the end of the piece, I'm basically fading everyone down. I'm using volume automation to do that. And, you know, this is something that works really well to just do a fade out at the end of the piece. Okay, so that's it for that piece. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.